'Tis I, Dr. Dementia, and wouldn't we all love to live prosperously? What with the 4th expansion of Dominion Weekend, Dominion Prosperity, released in October 2010? We just got an update pack. Who knew? I would have loved to see it come out already. They estimated the release of July 2022. I haven't seen it yet. I just got Seaside. Anyway, this is my favorite expansion. We're going to go over a couple of mechanics and then the cards. Let's get right into it.
Evolution cannot be stopped.
The first and simplest mechanic that was introduced with this set are victory tokens. Essentially a different way to earn victory points. Rather than having the cards, there are specific action cards that generate victory points in the form of these tokens. And you keep them on a mat, therefore making it easy to not having to rely on all of the victory cards that you can purchase. However, with the introduction of 2 specific base cards, that doesn't really help altogether. So if it wasn't obvious already, the theme of the expansion can be brought down to one simple word.
Money.
And the first base card to be introduced sums it up quite well. We now have Platinums, costing 9 to purchase, generating 5 coin. Now, right off the bat, this is the most expensive treasure you can get, and that shows for this expansion. It basically is a nice money generator, considering where golds were 3 and cost 6. So, mine, again, very good card, and this is fantastic, because it makes it easier to afford cards, as long as you have enough, but this way, you can deviate some of your golds that you've been buying in order to purchase Platinums now. I'd say a nice little added bonus. And it's a good thing we have Platinums, because it will be needed to purchase a brand new basic victory card, Colonies. Costing 11 to purchase, generating 10 victory points. This is disgusting, but this also changes the game in a couple of different ways. First off, the rule for ending the game with now draining the province pile now applies to the colony pile. Why do I say that? Because technically by the official rules, if you play with any cards in Prosperity, Platinum and Colony are part of that set. Though, to be perfectly honest, if you play the Steam version or you play the set at home, play them anyway. It's fun to just cause some chaos, and I love playing it regardless if we don't use Prosperity cards. That's awesome. Now, to get to these cards might be difficult. 11 costs is not that cheap, and it is the most expensive card you can afford to purchase in essentially any set. But there are ways around this. Those Platinums I just mentioned, well, you could remodel them. You could replace them. And boom, you have Colonies. Salvager. You get some money out of those Platinums and turn it into pure gold to buy that. Extra buys come into play. And you're going to find that some of the cards that come out in this set are going to be very useful to get to these colonies. Let's get to the list of cards that are in the version 1.0 of Prosperity. Now, like with the base game, Intrigue, and Seaside, I'm going to do this video on the 1.0 cards first, and then we'll do a separate video on the update pack, which have the version 2.0 cards for Prosperity. First card we're going to look at for Prosperity is Bank, a brand new treasure card for the set, costing 7 to purchase, plus 1 coin per treasure card you have in play, counting this. Now, Bank is an interesting treasure card, really focusing on what you have in play, rather than what you have anywhere else at that point. And that makes it interesting for its effect, because you're basically maximizing a deck where you can potentially draw into cards that will give you more treasures, individual treasures that you can place on the field and then immediately play to the bank. Sound great, right? Especially if you get it early on, it could potentially be at least worth a gold at that point, and it could be worth more depending on what else you can afford. I mean, silvers, platinums too. As long as your hand size is big enough as you get into it for each of your turns, that's fine. What's the problem with it though? Well, it has a high opportunity cost, and that makes it very difficult to acquire, just for the fact that it costs 7 just to start off with, and it does scale based on the number of treasures you have in play, which means you have to reliably draw into cards. And the thing in here is, there's not many cards that will basically help you draw into your high riches. Coppers, yes, when you think about the previous expansion, but you need also plus buys to really fully take advantage of this card. And with that kind of a setup, it makes you wonder, is there anything else worthwhile on the field that you can take advantage of purchasing? A strong draw could be accompanied by weak copper thinning, which is great, but you basically need straight up draw and buy. And your kingdom supplies really shouldn't have no superior action-based alternatives that would be great to offset you wanting to purchase this. And, I mean, yeah, if you buy any alchemy card, sure, the potion works for this. Any other kind of, I mean, harem works for this too, because they're all treasures. But this amounts to you having to play basically a treasure deck, which means you're not using actions to generate your coin. You basically want your actions to basically just draw into your deck constantly. So you basically need plus card and plus action to keep drawing into these. And once you have enough, you know, play the treasure. Native Village is an interesting one you could synergize with on this, I think, because you could place the banks aside once you obtain them, and then once you know you have a big enough hand, play Native Village again to bring out the bank. Now, being it is a treasure, you couldn't throne room this card. There's no way to do that with this, so that wouldn't work out so well. Basically, you just have to keep your eye out on your deck, and if you're able to draw into your deck effectively without much negative repercussion, then you should be good. You just got to be careful, because with some of those actions that make you scry into the deck a little bit, treasures are essentially your, what they call stop cards, which means they stop the effects from continuing at that point. Wharf is a good option as well, I will say, because it helps you basically just gain into this and easily get the plus spy on every turn. So that's a good duration card to work with. If you really wanted to take advantage of this and mine was available, remodel was available, replace is available, you could easily do this on a gold, no issue there, and just turn it into a bank. Especially if you have a lot of golds, you could probably afford a bank or two to do that. So there's a way to offset that cost. Considering not even in the early game, even in a 5-2 split, you can't pick this up early enough. You're probably not going to see this in the mid game. And again, this is totally based on what's available on the field right now. If you have good duration cards giving you those extra buys, or basically cards that are just going to draw into your deck, basically you're going to overdeck. This is perfect for you at that point. I would say mid-game at the earliest to pick this card up. Next card we're going to look at is Bishop. Costing 4 to purchase, +1 coin, +1 victory point. Trash a card from your hand, +1 victory point per 2 it costs, rounded down. Each other player may trash a card from their hand. This is a nice, fun way to generate victory point tokens without necessarily relying on the cards themselves to do it. It's not bad, and I mean, as a trasher, you can't go wrong with it. Though in this particular case, the cost of the card factors into it. Now, bear in mind, potion costs and dead costs is completely ignored in that secondary effect, so don't worry about that. You're looking at the pure treasure cost of that. And there is actually a very good action card we'll talk about later down in this set that works wonders with this, but you'll understand when you see it. This can synergize potentially well with cards that allow you to basically gain a better foothold in your deck, i.e., you have a way of generating expensive cards easily. And I'll give you a quick example and a good synergy to follow off on this, and that's Bandit. Bandit, every single time you play it, regardless if the attack effect goes off, you still gain a gold. What can you do with that gold? Well, you can use Bishop on it to just mill it out, and thanks to Bishop's effect, you're basically walking away with an extra 4 victory points without significantly lowering a supply pile or making your deck feel like absolute shit. And that's a good way to go off of this, especially if you are having trouble generating enough coin each turn to get more expensive victory cards like provinces and colonies. And that's good to really work with. There is a unique deck strategy involved with this, and I mean, basically, if you were able to do this, at that point, you are guaranteed a win because of how fast you're basically playing into this. A 5-card deck consisting of Bishop, Providence, Gold, Silver, and Silver. Providence. Basically, the way that works is that you would trash a province using Bishop every single turn, use the Gold and the 2 Silvers to buy another province. You're basically gaining at least +5 victory points every single turn. What this is also doing is thinning out the province supply pile. Once that empties out, the game automatically ends, and at that point, you're probably going to be great too. It's not bad for a trasher. I mean, yeah, there are other better trashers out there, and it's a decent option. But considering you're only trashing 1 card at a time, you might be thinking you're probably better off in the mid or late game where you would get rid of basically provinces to buy more provinces, golds if you got generation for that. Quarry are another good example to work off of this, especially. You could, if you wanted to on a 3-4 split in the very early game, purchase this and use this on your estates very quickly just to thin out your deck so your coppers can turn into some better cards inevitably in the future. It's more trash specific because unless you know that you have either estates you want to throw away just to turn them into victory points and thin out your deck better, or provinces that you know you can take the lead on and therefore dominate your opponents, so you're going to just basically end the game at that point. The only rare exception is if you have specific action cards you are no longer going to use during the game, and you've basically lost the option to play synergies or have a decent engine. You basically want to start a new engine without necessarily destroying your deck integrity. That's basically that. It's not a bad card for the cost, again, but because the specific way this is done, mid to late game, early game only if there is really no other option at a 4-cost card, besides the silver, of course, and you are basically looking to thin your deck out of those estates very quickly. Not a bad card, though. Still decent. And next card we're going to look at is City. Costing 5 to purchase, +1 card, +2 actions. If there are 1 or more empty supply piles, +1 card. If there are 2 or more, +1 buy, and +1 coin. This is the first kind of action card where it relies heavily on the supply piles themselves rather than the effects of it. Now, this is an interesting card, starting off as basically an expensive version of a village, but becoming more powerful as the piles get empty. That's great. That could potentially become a very powerful card in the late game. The problem here is you gotta empty the piles in order to get to that point. Fortunately, emptying 1 pile is enough to really make this card really great. I mean, +2 cards, +2 actions, once 1 pile is empty, is nothing to scoff at. And that can easily be accomplished, say, with a curse generator, such as Familiar, Witch, Sea Hag, Sea Witch, any of those. Even Replace. Replace is actually a very good synergy if we think about it, because we can replace a card, trashing 1, getting 1 from the piles, and then getting your curse. You're basically, essentially, emptying 2 piles all at once, making this card very effective in its full ability. The thing is the timing to when to purchase it, because if you see that this is the only card that's really giving you a lot of draw power compared to some of the others, your opponent might have the right idea. So you have to consider the question of whether or not you should buy this early enough for when that time comes, or if you should wait until the piles become decently small that you want to pick it up at that point. You gotta gauge it based on your opponent's actions. I mean, early on, if this and Village were out on the field, even for the cost, I would still pick up City just to get things started. But if you're gonna rely heavily on City, you need a very small deck, and this is probably gonna be the easiest way to overdeck, because once you get to those 2 empty piles, getting the +1 buy and the +1 coin will help generate some extra currency to get you to those colonies a lot faster, or some platinums too if you need it. This way you're not just drawing into this constantly. I would say early mid game, and you want to rely heavily on the fact that you're basically going to want to look at the piles on the field and make sure that you want to empty these before you go for City. You want to kind of think of that ahead of the game. So if there's a curse generator, get that quickly. Ironworks, Remodel, Replace, any Workshop, Feast, any of those cards are going to help you get to this a lot faster. University as well. The quickest way to empty piles. I mean, you could even Ironworks itself, Remodel itself, University itself. Hell, surprisingly, Transmute, another good option. Getting to those duchies quick enough, draining the duchies out is another good way to do this. Good to work off a bishop as well to drain the estates, but you're going to want to buy estates, obviously, in order to just quickly take advantage of it. So, mid-game at the very earliest is when you want to start racking up as many cities as possible. By endgame, you should have its full effect. If you don't, it's a waste to buy it at that point. So, late early to early mid-game. Fantastic card. I love this card personally, and recommend it just for some chaos. Next, we have another new treasure card for the set, Contraband. Costing 5 to purchase, it generates 3 coin and gives you +1 buy. The player to your left names a card. You can't buy that card this turn. Now, on the surface, 3 coin and +1 buy for 5 is very good, because it basically takes Astrolabe to a different level. Be that as it may, however, that secondary effect is very, very detrimental. Your opponent will basically decide on what they think is going to be the card you're going to select. Now, bear in mind, they can choose any action card, any treasure, any victory card, and basically say, nope, you can't have it. So, you really, really want to make sure that you do one particular thing when you play Contraband. When you're on your buy phase and you're presenting your treasures, Contraband goes down first. Now, your opponent could think ahead, look at your hand and say, oh, he could potentially have that much in treasure, I better go for the best output. You want to basically psych out your opponent when playing Contraband in order to figure out, in order to make them guess on a dead card that you know you're not going to need. Or at the very least, you want to consider more than one card to purchase on every single turn, so that way you can really work around this. I would say personally, this is a mid-game card only, and I'll tell you why. By late game, you and your opponent are going to be vying for provinces and colonies to a point that you're relying on this way too much. They will figure out that you want the colony, and if they can get the colony themselves on their turn, they're going to force you to buy something that's worth less in victory points so that they can get the upper hand sooner rather than later. With a mid-game, at the very least, you can pick out the last part of your action cards that you need for your engine, or at least a few more treasures, that it won't be so detrimental to you. But after a certain point, you're going to want to replace this, you're going to want to bishop it, you're going to want to mine it. I would say mining this into a bank is a good option because of the fact that at least bank will not restrict you, and at this point you'll have much more in treasure that it will be more effective than Contraband. It can be also a last resort of a plus buy, but I wouldn't rely heavily on it. Like I said, Astrolabe, which only costs 3, while it being a duration card and only giving you 1 coin generation per turn for its duration, is still decent enough that you can work it a lot better than Contraband can. Again, you want to basically play this at the point where they have as little information as possible as the rest of your turn. So if they know you have it, they need to start deciding what you're going to do. They essentially need to mind read you. But that's about it. Honestly, it's not one of my preferred favorites. And to be fair, an effect like this, where you're forced to determine what card your opponent's going to buy, Embargo is probably a better option than this. But, you know, it can still have its uses. You just got to think ahead. Next card we're going to look at is the Counting House. Costing 5 to purchase, look through your discard pile, reveal any number of coppers from it, and put them into your hand. Now, a little fun trivia. Donald X Roccarino's wife helped create this card. Just fun little trivia for you. Now, on the surface, somewhat of a weak card because it's dependent on how many coppers you have in your discard pile, but can still prove to be a very powerful one nonetheless. Now, when you think about this on the surface, 3 cards come to mind that really work wonders with this, and I've spoken about 2 of them numerous times: Moneylender and Coppersmith. But there is a third, and that is Apothecary. Basically, all of those combine to create a copper engine to systematically draw into coppers constantly, giving you the maximum output you can with those coppers, and basically buying the more expensive stuff with the relatively junk stuff. Now, be that as it may, there are a couple of other combos that work fantastic with Counting House to a degree. Those are cards I will not talk about now. They are in future expansions we will get into the video. Don't mind everything going on in the background. What can I say? I'm just sitting here minding my own business. Anyway, use cases, however, at that point become very rare. There is one that works well with it in this expansion, so we'll talk about that later on in this video. This can be gained to hand or on the top of the deck tactically in the late game if you know there are coppers in the discard pile, and that's basically you relying on those provinces, so you want to keep that in mind. I would say definitely early to mid. You definitely don't want this late game, because at that point, if you have more expensive cards, you're not really relying on anything copper generating, and you probably don't have many apothecaries in your deck considering the potion cost. But this is good if you have a very thin deck composed of mostly those 4 action cards combined, as well as obviously a potion or 2, or you have essentially just generated enough copper. So, while limited in use cases, still decent, but how often are you going to really generate coppers more than anything else? That part, I'm being honest. That's really the downside of it. And next we have Expand, costing 7 to purchase. Trash a card from your hand, gain a card costing up to 3 more than it. This is an automatic upgrade to Remodel, where it was a 2 cost rather than a 3 cost here. However, the major downside is, while Remodel was slightly cheaper in the fact that it only cost 4, Expand costs 7. And that's very difficult to really pull off. You're basically deciding if you want to get a Remodel because, first off, there's not many cards in Trashers on the field, or you do not have enough to get a province on that turn, but you don't need any more golds. However, it does have its unique benefits, and let's go over a few examples. First off, curses now are a little bit more viable to get rid of with Expand, because you can essentially turn those into either silvers or astrolabes, giving you a little bit more firepower in your decks, so that's not a bad option. Now, Expand is also a good way to deal with your estates as well, getting you essentially any 5-cost card that is available to you, or essentially upgrading those estates into duchies, therefore also upgrading those duchies into provinces, and then finally upgrading those provinces into colonies. Now, that also works well with the any other 8-cost card, and believe me, there is one more, we will talk about that, into colonies, basically milling golds into provinces. It's basically a nicer way to getting rid of some cards that are gonna help, and I'd say now it works a little bit better than mine, although with mine the treasures would go into your hand. In this case, they do not. So, your typical prime targets for trash for benefit effects, and it makes upgrade a little less useful while it does have that cantrip. However, I would still say if I had to choose between both Expand and Replace, Replace is still a much better version, better card for me, just because of the added effects that come along with it. Not saying that Expand isn't bad, don't get me wrong, because, for example, since potions are counted as part of the cost, you could take Familiar once you're done with the curse generation and basically turn that into a possession and have fun. At that point, not needing the potions anymore, you could also take the potions and turn them into banks. Or an Expand if you wanted to have another card in there. I don't know why you would have more than one Expand. I think 1 or 2 is enough if your deck is small enough. Basically, if you got this very early on, start with your coppers and your estates, giving you a little bit more firepower in what you purchase, and then work on your more expensive cards for that late game. Basically, making sure that you were maximizing your output on victory point. Next up, we have another trash for benefit effect card, Forge. Costing 7 to purchase, like Expand. Trash any number of cards from your hand. Gain a card with costs exactly equal to the total cost in coin of the trash cards. Now, this works a little bit differently from Expand, but this is essentially a very powerful upgrade from Chapel. Now, that cost, however, makes it a little bit tricky to really work with. But let's look at the pros for a second here. Unlike Chapel, there is no limit to the number of cards you can trash in your hand. Therefore, making a very large hand, such as Tactician or having the full effective city available to you, very useful in that effect, because then you can get rid of curses and coppers that you don't need. Even though you won't get anything for it, you can thin out your coppers into 1, get rid of your curses and form it into a single copper, or even better, get rid of your entry-level estates, and all 3 of those combined can turn into a fantastic gold. Or another card we'll talk about in this set that's actually really good that also costs 6. The thing is, you basically are relying on this to do most of the trashing for you if you have too much junk in your deck, while Expand relied heavily on specific cards that you wanted to specifically get rid of, and not all of them. Now, it's kind of difficult to really work on Forge's effect a lot better when the hand drawing can be a little bit tricky. So you want to definitely take advantage of this when you know you can kind of overdeck into your hands, giving you large hands to be able to choose whichever cards you want. Now, if the cost is a little bit nasty for you, you could try to bridge into it, even throne room bridge, and see if you can get it very early on. Another option would be once you have provinces available to you and a silver, you could forge them into a colony right then and there, no issues asked, thinning out your deck, still giving you a slight increase in victory points. Not the best option I would use for it, but this is a good example nonetheless. In some cases, it's worthwhile to also trash a set of cards whose price don't add up to anything at all, and you gain nothing for it. That's fine. You're basically getting rid of useless cards as a result of it. Again, good for your coppers and curses when you don't need them. Obviously, you don't want curses. Getting rid of your states for something a little bit better. I mean, hell, you could basically forge a gold and an estate into a province. It's great. You basically will start this off in the mid-game, really thinning out your deck with the useless stuff, especially if Curse Generation happens to play a major part into this. And then late game, when you are ready to turn this into some victory point cards, or even victory points in general. If for whatever reason you thought it was a good idea, native villaging Forge until the time was right would probably be the good option. You could couple that with Tactician perfectly, giving you the right setup to do this all at once, and then the next few hands are probably going to look a lot more favorable of you. At that point, you probably have everything you need to essentially buy a province or a colony every single turn after that. So that's really the main case that you really want this to be excellent for you. But all around, because of its cost, mid to late game, and really dependent on you having the right cards in your hand, because if you don't have the right exact combo, you won't get anything out of it. So you should at least make sure, at least for the first few times you use Forge, you want something to benefit you. So you really need to see all the costs of all the cards on the field, and then use Forge's effect. Still a very impressive card, and definitely a viable upgrade over Chapel. Next, we have potentially what is one of my favorite cards, not only in this expansion, but in the game in general. And it's actually funny because of the way it works. Grand Market. Costing 6 to purchase, plus 1 card, plus 1 action, plus 1 buy, plus 2 coin. However, you can't buy this if you have any coppers in play. This is a very strong, albeit a different version of the normal market. We know it's a very strong version of one, with a very steep limitation. It's actually funny I talked about Forge previously, because forging 3 estates can get you a Grand Market, and at that point you basically start working on multiple Grand Markets once you have your first one. Now, a single copper presenting for buy-in will be enough to stop you from playing Grand Market, but that sets alongside a special rule made because of this card's effect. You do not have to play all of your treasures in your hand. Going back to Contraband's effect, that you can actually force what you play once your opponent knows what you have, and that makes it easier to purchase Grand Market. It is very strong and integrates smoothly into almost any deck. If you are reliantly going to get Grand Markets, you are basically looking to thin out your coppers as best as you can. So mining the coppers and the silvers and astrolabes, because those will work, getting golds, getting platinums. Once you got a couple of these, you're set to go. That makes Moneylender a good card to use in order to get Grand Market. Now, in terms of synergy, well, Throne Room is a fantastic synergy, because then it makes it a +2 card, +2 action, +2 buy, +4 coin. You're guaranteed to get another one, which makes Bridge a very good card to generate more Grand Markets, just to lower its cost. There is another card that does that in this expansion. I'll get to that one later. But another fantastic approach, if you are having trouble generating the currency, especially having more coppers than you would really love, well, you can also lurker the card. thereby also giving you an added option of being able to do that for yourself before your opponent can do it, and a very cheap way to get the grand markets faster. You can also bridge into Ironworks for it, and Throne Room in it isn't too bad, but you might be pushing it a little bit. You may not when you see what else is available in this setup. This is a very good card, and it's basically tied to how difficult it is to thin out your coppers. Once you have at least a couple of these in your deck, one of two things should occur. Basically, your deck should be thin enough that you're able to constantly play into these, or you're able to successfully buy more of these on a constant turn basis that the coppers become completely useless. You want to work on Moneylender's effect in order to be able to continuously purchase more of these, and that's going to be the easiest way to do it, and also makes mine a good option to get rid of those coppers into silvers and astrolabes as well. Now, that's basically going over a good way to get this. This is basically a cantrip with a very, very good added benefit here. There's a lot of cards you can go into play with this. You basically could just expand into it, you can forge into it, you can replace, you can remodel. Any card will get you into this. This will work essentially with everything. It's a cantrip with a very powerful benefit. I would say this is a much better option than Treasury because of the fact that you got +2 coin. You thin out your deck enough that you basically have a few treasures and you're basically covered with grand markets. You will basically be able to purchase anything into this. The tricky part is just being able to buy your first one. Once you do that, you're golden. And that's it. And there are so many ways you can do that. Once you have it in play, Throne Room this thing because you will enjoy it. And as a matter of fact, there's an upgrade to Throne Room. We'll talk about that one very shortly. But this is a fantastic card for use in any circumstance here. I mean, literally a Terminal Silver withdrawal power. This is much better than Mills in terms of what this gives you, because that plus buy is nothing to scoff at. And if you stack up those buys, you can basically do very well with this. And actually, now that I think about that, the next card we're going to go over actually works well with having multiple buys. So that's a good synergy to work off of. So let's get right into that next one. And that would be Goons. Costing 6 to purchase, +1 buy, +2 coin. Each of the player discards down to 3 cards in hand. In addition, while you have this in play, when you buy a card, +1 victory point. This relies heavily on the fact that you need buys in order to take advantage of it. Fortunately, Goons gives you that right off the bat, which is why I said Grand Market and stacking your deck with Grand Markets is a viable option to take advantage of Goons. And then, in addition, being able to basically force a Militia effect on your opponents, solid upgrade from Militia. But this is reliant on having multiple buys available to you and being able to purchase very quickly every single turn to generate more victory points. And I will say, in some circumstances, maybe getting a estate wouldn't be so bad, but you really don't want to be getting more junk cards like coppers or other zero cost cards in order to do it. And you definitely don't want to crisp, please. That would just offset that here. It basically depends on the engine of your deck build, and if you're able to play multiple Goons on, a single turn, then yeah, that would be great. So, and here's the thing. You want to play multiple copies of this because the effect relies on it being in play. So, for example, if you Throne Rooms a Goons, you will be able to play the card twice. However, there's only one copy of it on the field. So buying something would only generate you +1 victory point. If you have more than one, say if you have 2 sets, if you play 2 Goons back to back, then each purchase would give you +2 victory points. So this is heavily consistent on the amount of actions you can play each and every turn. So basically your villages, basically your laboratories, basically cities. Once you at least kill off one supply pile, that's the thing. Deck control is the key, and if you cannot gain deck control for yourself, this card comes crashing down, and you don't want that to happen at 6 cost, especially when you do not get any extra actions for it. That buy is powerful enough on its own, but actions are going to be useful. I would say this is much better on victory point generation in some aspects than Bishop if you can buy heavily. Again, Grand Market being a very good use case in this, especially if you can go Grand Market into that, Grand Market into that, Grand Market into that, but you do need more actions to be able to pull this off. Tactician makes this very good then, because then you can just play into these a few more times than you would like, and you would have so many buys you don't know what to do with it. This, by mid-game, you should be pretty much overdecking into these cards on a constant basis, and this will help you either buy enough for a 3-pile ending or just outpacing your opponent in victory points. You would think that's great, but that basically limits when you want to do this, and because of that, getting the high cost victory point cards, or it could maybe, unless it was the end of the game, you don't really want to use it on that. You basically want to use it to keep generating your victory points for purchases. So that's how you're basically going to rely on winning the game. And if you can't generate enough every turn and your opponent's pulling out the provinces and colonies, you're going to lose your power very quick. So this requires careful planning and making sure that you have a very good engine in store. And especially with that cost, you're looking at mid-game at the very earliest seeing this card being picked up. So you have to decide at that point if you want this or you want Grand Market. Again, Lurker helps. Bridging for Ironworks helps out a lot as well. Remodel, expand, forge. Any ways that can get you into this quickly will help out a lot. The problem here with Goons, though, is if you are relying solely on Goons and you cannot create a deck fast enough to work this card, then it will become a dead card for you very quick, and your opponent might be able to outpace you faster, and who knows, they might do better for you. It's a good card. It will have its limits if you are not careful, though. Again, mid to late game. And the next card is yet another new treasure card for the set, Hoard. Costing 6 to purchase, generating 2 coin. This turn, when you gain a victory card, if you bought it, you gain a gold. Now, off the bat, paying 6 for this, bit of a steep price. I wouldn't do that unless the effect was actually worth it, and in a few circumstances it is. This is usually a very good card when you have total deck control and you have thinned out your deck to the point that you have just the important cards that you need and can generate you at least a decent victory card every turn, such as the province or even a colony. With Hoard's help, it would make it more viable to maybe even get 2 provinces, because gaining a gold from just buying any victory card can be potentially useful. This is a very good in a high money density deck with relying heavily on money strategies, and this is basically going to be your way for generating green cards, just like Bandit is, just giving you a gold right off the bat, and Quarry as well, using its effect to get a gold too. This will eventually run out effects for you, but the fact that it costs 6 will be useful for your trash or benefit cards such as Apprentice, Remodel, even Expand, going right into that Platinum, even mine as well, going right into that Platinum too. A single Hoard can just provide high price fodder when you're done with it. And another useful thing that you can really use this card with are those dual victory cards such as Nobles, Mills, Great Halls, and Harem, because since they're all victory cards, even though you get an effect for it, you're generating a gold every time you do it. So that's an easy and quick, simple way to do this. The thing is, you have to immediately get it, and it's not like Lurker where you can just use that to gain an action card. No, it's a pure treasure, so you really need to make sure that you have a good money strategy on hand first before you pick this up. And in any kind of deck, especially one where you're relying heavily on your own deck control strategy, you don't want that many. 1 or 2 at the most. I mean, obviously, if you have 2 Hoards in play, for example, and you buy, let's say, 2 Duchies, you're gonna gain 4 golds, which, I mean, is already a better way to do that rather than using treasure maps effect, because at least the treasures count for something. The treasure maps are just fodder in there until you can activate them. We'll go into a very specific card down the line that really works well with this card. Actually, it'll be in the next video because it's part of the update pack. But overall, it's not a bad card. Definitely not an early game card. unless for some obvious reason you're able to pick this up very quickly, and yes, bridge can work in this circumstance, so that wouldn't be so bad. You could also expand upon it, or replace into it too, so you can get it really quickly, but at that point you're in the mid-game. You want to make sure that if you're going to take advantage of Hoard's full power, you've thinned out your deck of the crappy cards, so you keep drawing into these, and that way you're not running into using any coppers in the deck. You're relying heavily on anything with treasure cost 2 or not treasure cost, treasure amount 2 or more. So these are at very least gonna be useful for you to take advantage of. And again, dual victory cards are a good target on Hoard, so if you can see those out there, go ahead and grab those when you can. And then once you've reached the point where you're generating enough coin that Hoard really isn't useful to you and will flood your deck with golds, again, trashing it for a benefit is just as viable. Again, mid-game at the earliest, once you have enough power in your deck. And now we're going to go into potentially one of the most broken cards of the set and of the game, just because of how powerful it is, and it's such a simple card when you look at it from the surface. It's called King's Court. Costing 7 to purchase, you may play an action card from your hand 3 times. This is an immediate upgrade from Throne Room, and one of the most disgusting cards possible. Let's look at it from... let's look the downside first before I go into the outrageous upsides to this card. 7 cost. This is a mid-game card at the earliest because of that cost. Same thing with Expand. However, in this particular case, if you have good action cards on the field, you want to prioritize King's Court over anything else. And you really need to have good deck control so that this works at it. Let's talk about its strengths. The efficiency of triple playing, how it can function as a very strong village, and it can act as draw. Gee, I wonder why. Let's look at the triple play. First off, bridge. I don't need to describe how disgusting playing bridge 3 times in one effect is. Just, you reduce the cost of every card on the field by 3, while at the same time essentially getting 3 extra buys and 3 extra coin. If you can't afford anything on that turn as a result, I don't know what you can. And that makes it utterly disgusting because it gives you pretty much every ability to play that. You could build a hand. You could build a deck that you have a hand of 2 King's Court and 3 bridges. You're able to buy all 8 provinces. No questions asked. This allows a lot more flexibility in your deck when you don't need as many cards like this compared to Throne Room, where you would need at least 5 to do the job and more copies of bridge. So deck efficiency is a very strong suit. Now let's look at another example. Lurker. Basically trashing cards you know your opponent's not going to need, and then immediately following just picking one up for yourself on the same turn without having to play Lurker multiple times. Also giving yourself an extra 3 action, an extra plus 3 actions. You're basically set for playing those cards immediately. Well, you would if you could get them into your hand, but there's ways around that as well. But it's disgusting. Now, let's look at it in terms of its draw power. Let's see. I don't know. Laboratory. The Harbinger is great as well, which makes Mills fantastic. And let's not talk about Grand Market for that example. You play one Grand Market, you're set for life. You draw into this, that's disgusting. And yes, Treasury kind of works that way, but you would only be able to use its effect once. But yeah, no. Play that. That's go for it. I don't mind. You could also replace 3 times. And if you keep buying victory cards, let's give your opponent a whole bunch of freaking curses while we're at it. There is outstanding viability. I don't care it costs 7. It's disgusting and I love it. And you want more disgusting? Let's King's Court possession while we're at it. Your opponent will give up. Your opponent will just table flip. And I don't blame him. Again, the only downside to this card is that cost, and it's making sure you have established some deck control and basically thinned out your deck full of the get rid of all the crappier cards that you know you're not going to need, because the worst thing you can do is draw into a King's Court and nothing else. And believe me, I have done that before. And then, of course, you know, that's it. There's not much more I can say on it. There are cards that I could go over to every single card that would synergize beautifully with this card, and cards that will come up that will synergize beautifully with this card. But basically, your possibilities are endless. This all comes down to what is available to you in your piles, and basically if you can get a King's Court fast enough. Also, because if you keep your deck thin enough, you don't need many King's Courts. A couple of them will considerably do the game for you. And if you can overdeck, well, you basically have free reign to invoke as much chaos as possible. Mid-game card at the earliest, if you can get it, and limit yourself to a couple just so that you can overpower very easily. Next up, we have a new treasure known as Loan. Costing 3 to purchase, it generates 1 coin. Reveal cards from your deck until you reveal a treasure. Discard it or trash it. Discard the other cards. This screams early game to me, and for all the right reasons. This is basically allowing you to shift through your estates so you can draw into your coppers a lot early, and this is the only copper trasher. This is good for thinning out your deck early on. However, that's mostly where the main advantages end. I mean, it does only cost 3 coin and can act as a cantrip to ship past the estates. But at that point, that's it. Once you start buying more expensive treasures, the last thing you want to do is either discard or trash it using this card. And the problem is, while you are shifting past your estates, you're not able to trash them with this card. Makes it potentially worse than something, say, like Salvager, and it's not useful in money strategies either. You're better off in that case drawing through your coppers rather than trashing, such as with War. And I don't like this card at all. I'm gonna be a little bit more biased about it. Yes, thinning is good early game. Getting rid of the states early on are good. But if you can't get rid of them, though, I wouldn't. You know, now this can work well when you have action cards that don't provide a lot of draws, such as Goons or Bridge. But once you reach a certain point, again, you're going to have your silvers, you're going to have your golds, you might have a Hoard or 2 in there as well. Hell, Philosopher's Stone, better option in this particular case. A lot of the other treasure cards just outweigh this one, even Bank does. And I don't want to come to a point where you use Loan and you draw into a gold, or even worse, a platinum. So once you've reached the mid-game, get rid of the card. Do whatever it takes to get rid of it. At the very most convenient thing you can think of, mind or expand, you can turn this into a gold or a Hoard if you wanted to as well. But the point being is, you don't want this in your deck the entire time, and you're eventually gonna reach a mindset where you're gonna draw into it, and that's it. You don't want to play it. Because, I mean, yes, for 3 it's not bad, but you're only gaining 1 for it. Thinning is very valuable, then yes, take advantage of this. I can't see any deck using more than 1 of these, especially if you're only going to be in the early game. And the other major problem with this is, if you have Loan, it's going to hesitate making you want to purchase any other treasures, which is also going to slow down your bill. So you're basically relying at that point any action card that's generating coin for you. That's viable, but you're discarding all the other cards getting from 1 coin to another, so eventually Loan's gonna run out. Again, early game to thin, and then that's it. I don't like this card at all in the slightest. Next, we have an action card that is somewhat unique, not only for its effect, but for its cost as well. You'll understand what I mean in a second when I explain it. It's called Mint. Costing 5 to purchase. You may reveal a treasure card from your hand, gain a copy of it. That's the action effect. For its cost, however, when you gain this, trash all non-duration treasures you have in play. Now, most people would look at this card from the surface and think that's a negative thing. However, most people would take advantage of Mint for its cost rather than it's for its action and effect. Let's think about it this way. Especially if you can get this card very early on and you have a bunch of coppers that you don't need, Mint is going to cement that for you because it will get rid of those cobblers and give you better access to a lot of your treasures, specifically ones generated by your action cards. Though, it does say non-duration treasures. So a good card that you can have to work well with Mint's cost is Astrolabe, because it is a duration treasure. Keeping that in mind, this is one of the few cards I would say you don't want to use an Ironworks or a workshop to go into this card. There's absolutely no reason on the surface to not trash crap treasures you don't need to thin out your deck a lot better. So if you combine this with Remodel as a potential good synergy, then you will thin out a good chunk of your coppers and your estates in a heartbeat. Then you can really use Mint's effect. It is uncommon to use it as a treasure gainer, again, because people are going to use it on its power to trash upon gaining it. However, if you do have a strong target, say like a platinum, then go ahead and use this, because it gives you a platinum without having to spend the money for a one. There is another treasure card we will talk about in a future expansion that works very well with this. But overall, this is one of the few cards I've talked about where its cost is a better thing about the card than its actual effect overall. I would not do this on a 5-2 split. That is probably the extreme case of using Mint's effect. Yes, you will get rid of 5 coppers, but you're still going to be left with 2, and then your 3 estates. So you need to have something already in there, good to go, that you can do with your estates. You need to have either action cards that are going to generate currency for you, or much better treasure cards that are available as well. Astrolabe or a silver, and you need to be able to do that. So Remodel or Replace has to be in there before you actually want to use Mint's effect. Now, at that point, the deck might be a little bit bigger, so you want to make sure that you can thin out to your coppers as quickly as possible. And Counting House, good option to fall upon that to make sure that that is the case for you to purchase Mint. So if you can discard your coppers, get them out there, and then perhaps even get an extra buy with Bridge, and then Coppersmith into them, then you basically will have a very good turn, and you can basically get a better engine ready to go for you. Early to mid, and don't even go late game on this. Time it with when you have the coppers to do it. And have an Astrolabe every now and then to help out a lot. Next card we have is very simple on what it does, and that is Monument, costing 4 to purchase, plus 2 coin, plus 1 victory point. Simple as that. Now, this is basically on the surface a terminal silver, but it also provides a little bit of victory points once played. And honestly, comparing this between this and Bishop forces you to trash something to gain more victory points. Here, there's no trashing. You gain the coin, you gain the victory point, done and done. This is useful in some early payload when you have no better use for your space in your deck, and you basically need to rep up for better deck control components. I mean, again, it's worth a silver and an extra victory point for 1 extra cost. That's not bad on a 4-3 split. Probably one of the easiest things you can pick up if there's nothing else to really settle in on. And this will help work your way up to some better options, which is good for the synergy. And King's Court is a good synergy, because basically the biggest strength for this card is if you can play multiple of them on the same turn. So being able to King's Court of Monument gives you +6 and +3 victory points right off the bat. If you can continuously do this every turn, you're going to be able to outpace your opponent in victory points without necessarily having to buy the victory cards. And that gives you more ample time to basically stall your opponent out and go for emptying out supply piles as an alternative option, instead of trying to go for those more expensive ones. Now, Monument may not become important enough if the Kingdom offers a way to generate more victory points quickly. So unless King Court is an option, I wouldn't take this unless you could. This is also much better when you don't have giant turns, aka using Tactician, because at that point you could probably just afford a colony, maybe 2, depending on what you have in terms of treasure. So its usefulness will wear out. This is a check your supply pile card and see what's available. This can be a good early game card to rack up some extra coin and those victory points very fast. Mid-game, kind of, but your deck already has to have the necessary control to do it. This is not a late-game card, though. Not on the slightest, because if you already have his engine set up with some much better options, I would skip on this one. This is good early on, but that's about it. Very simple for what it does. I do like the card. Next up, we have another attack card that is possibly one of the more powerful curse generators that have become available in Dominion, and that's Mountebank. Mountebank costs 5 for the purchase, plus 2 coin. Each of the player may discard a curse. If they don't, they gain a curse and a copper. Now, I say it's one of the more powerful ones because instead of giving you just a single curse, it actually gives you a curse and a copper. Otherwise, 2 junk cards, which can weaken your opponent's deck that would otherwise be able to get more efficient deck control. Like other curse generators, it becomes less effective who've already been hit a few times. And Mountebank suffers a lot more on that effect because they could just discard the curse and boom, that's it. They don't get that secondary effect, which means they don't have to gain an extra copper. Now, granted, you could run out of curses or coppers. I don't know, if the game's going on for that long, and they'd still gain the other card if that was the case. Now, Terminal Solar, not a bad choice on a 5 cost with this effect in hand. Good to pick up, especially in one of your very first turns on a 5-2 split. Usually priority if you have the plan to take advantage of it, and maybe a way to exile other Mountebanks out on the supply piles, especially with Lurker on that case. It does suffer. Thinning becomes a little bit easier, and if Trapple's available, you can handle Mountebank a lot better as a result of that. And at that point, if you have a lot of trashers, Mountebank might not be the best choice because they probably will just trash the cards one way or the other. Yeah, Salvager, they won't get anything on it, but Chapel will at least get rid of a lot of options there. And they could also do, Forge as well, and get rid of as many as possible here. And another good counter to Mountebank is Courtyard, because if they know Mountebank's going to come up, they can essentially put a curse on top of their deck to offset the fact that Mountebank's going to be played, and then boom, that's about it. That's why you don't need many copies of Mountebank, because it's conditional junking at the very best. It's only very reliable if you can get this in the opening on the very early game as much as possible. I don't see this being, you could get this in the early mid game, but definitely not in the late game. This is more of a very early game as a good choice, but only when trashers are not readily available. If they are, especially Chapel, this loses strength very, very, very quickly. Next card we're going to look at is the most expensive card that has ever been released, but there is a way to work around that. The name of the card is Peddler. Costing 8 to purchase, plus 1 card, plus 1 action, plus 1 coin. During a player's buy phase, this costs 2 less per action card they have in play. Now, because of the way that this card works, your goal before you purchase Peddlers is to reduce that cost from that big 8 to a fat 0. And that is usually easy enough to do. Before we go into that, let's look at the card itself. It is a cantrip. I've talked about cantrips before in more than one way. However, it does provide a +1 in coin without adding a stop card such as another treasure popping into it. Because of the fact that it is cost changing, it is easy to acquire it in bulk using effects such as Bridge and King's Courting said Bridge in order to get to it. Now, the way this effect works is the fact that you have to have a certain amount of cards in play. You have to play 4 action cards. Fortunately, as you purchase more of these, it is easy enough to do it. Your goal is to basically play enough action cards, especially ones with plus draw and plus action, getting plus buys, in order to purchase multiple of those. This makes this probably one of the fastest piles that could get emptied out before anything else, making City a good follow-up on Peddler's effect, and one I would heavily recommend. Where this card shines, trash for benefit effects with that cost. Let's look at it. Remodel, Salvager, Bishop. All 3 of those cards are prime targets to hit up on Peddler. Just being able to trash this for the full price that it came out in, which was 8, rather than what you paid for it. That's a major difference and a hell of a powerful one. Though I would also put Expand on there if you had it, because then you could automatically turn this into a nice, fantastic colony. Though, turning this into Platinums is not a bad thing. I wouldn't do that all the time, though. Bishop is good in this particular case because you can generate a great ton of victory points without draining your deck of more victory cards at the sacrifice of a single Peddler. The main goal with this card is you want to make sure that you can get this to 0 as much as possible. Though if you can get it to 2, that's not bad. 4, even great too. But you want to try to strive for that. That's 0. And duration cards is an excellent way to do that because they count as an action card being played. If you can afford to get one Peddler, especially at 0 cost, you want to make sure that you have the plus buys necessary to buy as many as possible. So your markets, your grand markets, your feasts, your bridges, they're all going to be tied in to make sure that you get these. And you want them as soon as possible. If your opponent's going to pick them up, you need to pick them up. You don't want to give your opponent that much of an outstanding advantage simply just generating coin using these cards that it could mean the end of the game for you. Now again, once you have as many, or if all of these as possible, that's when you can really create some power in your deck. This relies heavily on making sure you have the correct supply piles to do it, and you want the buys necessary to get as many as possible. This is definitely a mid-game card at the very earliest. I cannot and definitely will not recommend paying 8 for this when you can get a province. That's why I like that secondary effect. This gives you the ability to create your deck around this card, basically becoming a synergy for any deck you set up. Mid-game at the earliest. Next up, we have yet another new treasure. We're getting a lot of treasures. Theme of prosperity, of course. Quarry. Costing 4 to purchase, generates 1 coin. This turn, actions cost 2 less. Now, we're looking at a treasure variant of Bridge to a degree. So again, this is a card that relies heavily upon having the buys necessary to do it. There's a big difference, though, between Bridge and this. This specifically targets action cards. So, in a specific example, those dual victory cards from Intrigue, Mills, Great Halls, and Nobles are targeted by this. Harems is not because it is a victory treasure, not a victory action. Keep that in mind. That means that this is basically designed to ramp up your synergies. This is basically getting your deck ready to start purchasing victory cards because those cannot be touched, minus those 3 cards I just mentioned. Now, what is nice about Quarry is that you can play more than one, and the effect stacks. And that's great because you can essentially turn Grand Market into a 2-cost card if you have the necessary buys for it, which makes this as a very good synergy to take advantage of that, and the two of them complement each other. So does Market as well. Those 3 cards complement each other because of the necessary buys and the fact that you can use Quarry to reduce its cost significantly. Now, this is also a nice workaround on Peddler if you cannot get enough action cards played to reduce its cost itself. Another good way to see that going. Good on cities as well. This is basically good on a lot of your action cards for draw and buys. The only downside to this card is that it is not for treasures. It is also not for victory points. So you're basically using this until you have your necessary synergy, and then at that point you could probably trash or discard it for much more viable options at that point. Now, what makes this good is that Black Market becomes a nice synergy on this card because anything you purchase on there, especially if it's all action, you gain the benefit of Quarry. And again, having a couple of these, I say, is worth it for the cost and for the amount of coin generated because of the effect stacking. Why? Let's say you had 2 of them. Well, King's Court costs 3 then. Congratulations. You just spent a lot less money doing that. And you probably have another buy, so go ahead and purchase it. So stacking this with Bridge is another way to work around that, because Bridge, at least, you can use King's Court on, while Quarry, you need multiple copies of it. That is its only major downside, but still a very good effective one nonetheless, and one I definitely like. At the utmost max, if you're keeping your deck very thin, 3 copies of Quarry, After that, not really. Early game to mid on this card because you're basically building up your deck. By late game, you've already have the necessary cards needed, and at that point, you can safely discard or trash Quarry for its cost for either victory points, currency, or even card draw, and then you can just go to town at that point. Still a fun card. Next up, we have another new attack card in the form of Rabble. Costing 5 to purchase, plus 3 cards. Each other player reveals the top 3 cards of their deck, discards the actions and treasures, and puts the rest back in any order they choose. A mild upgrade to Smithy in the form that it can give you plus 3 draw, but that attack effect is a little bit more different. I would say on the surface, it doesn't do a lot. Let's look at it this way. If we remind ourselves of Saboteur from Intrigue, this could be more of a benefit to your opponent rather than a detriment, because they could essentially get rid of unnecessary coppers or actions that they know they're not going to need, and they could draw into it. There are very rare circumstances where being able to mill your opponent in deck inspection would be very viable in Rabble's case. I mean, it could give it a moderate advantage, basically giving them a better chance of drawing into a lot of victory cards. I mean, that would be great. I mean, you could discard a key card, specifically. You won't know until you see the card. If your opponent has good deck control, however, they might be ready for Rabble's effect. And honestly, for plus 3 cards and this effect, it's not the strongest. Honestly, I would not pay 5 for plus 3 cards when Smithy costs 4, and you get the same without having an unnecessary attack. They might be able to work around that. And again, if they want you to discard the coppers, hell, more power to them. They probably will get rid of the coppers a little later on, and will have more powerful treasures available to them. You might get lucky, you might not. It really depends. It's good early game if you can get this immediately out, because then at the very least, you could basically discard as many coppers as needed, thereby giving them a hand with just all 3 of their estates in hand. If you were able to do that, they might have a 5-2-2 split as a result of it. But this would have to be one of the first cards you picked up. If you really wanted to take advantage of it, late early game, because at that point they're still trying to build up their deck and they still need to generate treasure somehow. I would really only pick up Rabble in particular cases where your draw power in supply piles is not strong, and this is one of your best options. But if you're playing with other cards, there's always a way around that. And yes, 3 cards might draw you into something decent, but a 3-for-3 exchange, it could go badly. So limit yourself on the card if needed. We seem to not be done with the treasure cards, it seems. Next one we have is Royal Seal. Costing 5 the purchase, generated 2 coin. While you have this in play, when you gain a card, you may put that card onto your deck. Now, being able to top deck anything available to you when you purchase the card is very useful. So that makes Black Market a viable synergy right off the bat, just being able to take advantage of that effect for the next turn and giving yourself an opportunity to use a card your opponent wouldn't normally be able to get. However, that top decking is where the pros end, sadly. Now, being able to do that, while great, is not great for a 5-cost card that only generates 2 coin. I would like to see some other effects on here. This would be much better as an action card if it gave you plus card or plus action, being able to do so. I wouldn't pay 2 more on a silver to do this effect if most of the cards that are available to you in the kingdom are within that 4 to 5 price range and nothing else. This would only be great if you had some cards in the 6 or higher. You'd be looking at basically Hoard, Grand Market, or Peddler as an example, even Expand in some cases, or Forge. But that's about it, and the chances of you being able to do that on randomizing your kingdoms is not going to be useful to you. And really, this only makes it viable if you could just top deck anything more expensive than that. I'm not saying that the top decking effect is not bad. It is a good effect in principle, guaranteeing access to your new purchases, especially if you have new attacks. But you would have to consider this to be your first purchase, and if there were more powerful cards available, that would not be the case. And basically on a 5-2 split, I could see you purchasing something else rather than this, when you'd still have to draw into the Royal Seal to do it. It's going to run out of steam sooner or later. I would say, if you really wanted to take advantage of this, it would have to be an early game card. On a 5-2 split, it would have to be one of your first purchases, but I would still consider what's on the supply piles before you took Royal Seal as an alternative option. Mid-game or late game, no. That's not, no, I don't see that happening. Because it's not going to work out great. Then even more treasure to discuss. Next one is Talisman. Costing 4 to purchase. Generates 1 coin. While you have this in play, when you buy a non-victory card costing 4 or less, gain a copy of it. A treasure in workshop form, essentially. Not bad when you consider the fact that, you know, this also works viably with cost reduction, such as Bridge or even Quarry, and this does help get you Peddlers a lot quicker, or even Grand Markets, because even though it generates 1, it is not a copper, so that will definitely help you out there. However, in terms of being a workshop variant, it is not the strongest there. You basically have to spend a Vi to activate this effect rather than use it as an action. Therefore, giving your buys a little bit more flexibility. This heavily relies on the fact that you need buys. I mean, it can, you know, getting 3 buys and a sufficient amount of coin, a single Talisman can get you 3 cards rather than 1, depending on the circumstance. And you will have a much better chance of not only pile control, but clearing piles as well. That's about it. I mean, the only thing is, it would not help you get victory cards. That would be the only thing bad about it, but it isn't the strongest in terms of the variance of workshops. I mean, obviously, workshop by itself, you can gain any card costing up to 4 and Iron Worst. We've talked about it, not to mention Blockade for that example. You're limited in terms of which ones you can gain, and again, if those cards are not available to you, Talisman's gonna probably be a dud in terms of its supply pile. If you can find, you know, a village costing 4, that's going to be your common targets. But if there's nothing else available to you, you're looking at a dead card, essentially, and you're not going to really use it. If you do, however, early game because of its low cost, and you wanted to synergize with Bridge and Quarry if you have it available to you. Next up, we've got another action card that actually introduces a slightly new mechanic specifically for this setup, and that is Trade Route. Costing 3 to purchase, plus 1 buy, trash a card from your hand, plus 1 coin per coin token on the Trade Route mat. With setup included, add a coin token to each of the victory supply piles, move that token to the Trade Route map when a card is gained from that pile. Now, basically the expansion came with these trade route maps that you would use to keep track of how many tokens were on the victory cards and how many were on the mat, therefore letting you know how much you could benefit from using trade route. Now, 3 costs for a plus 1 buy, that's actually pretty good. However, if you look at this card specifically, its ramp up as well as its benefit are somewhat very weak. Now, you could have dual victory cards on here. If you basically had harems, mills, great halls, and nobles, that's 4 right there. Add on estates, provinces, duchies, and colonies, that's another 4 there. You'd have a total of 8 piles for using these coin tokens. So in a hindsight, trashing a card to gain plus 8 per coin token is usually very good. I really don't see this though unless you're going to use it on your coppers and your estates, but by the time you've hit that end game point where that is beneficial, is it really worth it? Not really. The problem here is it's gonna take so much to generate the necessary coin to buy each and every individual victory card once to be able to use it, and no one's gonna forcefully buy an estate or an estate especially if they know they basically can't, if they can get something better. They're not going to do that. That's counterproductive at that point. This is a very weak card for thinning. This is a very weak card for basically a powerful payload. And that is very dependent on how you're going to play the game. You might not even buy victory cards. You might be generating victory point tokens, making this much less viable. I don't see this really taking off unless you had dual victory cards available to you, other alternative victory cards such as gardens, dukes, and even vineyards as well available to you. But if you had those, you're basically reliant on those other victory cards in your deck as well, especially with Duke, which makes that even doubly bad. And basically, it's a weak trasher if you don't have any of the victory cards purchased. I would say get it early game, but at that point you would have to stop buying a duchy and an estate first, or at least a dual victory card. This could have had a lot more potential. I am hinting at something for the update pack, but we'll get to that point when we get to it. Again, if we're gonna really take advantage of this card, you basically want to get this in the mid game. You shouldn't even have it in the early game because it's not going to be worth much, and you're basically only going to have this for a buy, and there are other cards that you can potentially use that would give you the buys a lot better. Late game, the only reason I would see this being used is if there were no other cards available to you that was generating the amount of coin that you necessarily need. If only the basic victory cards were available, it's still weaker than a platinum. Next card we're going to take a look at has a lot of viable synergy with some potentially good cards. Vault, costing 5 to purchase, plus 2 cards. Discard any number of cards for plus 1 coin each. Each other player may discard 2 cards to draw a card. So let's start off with the back with that secondary effect. That gives them a chance to get a better hand. I would say that's the only cost to being able to purchase it, but then again, paying 5 for this can be a really bad terminal draw. It could turn it into a weak one. However, it's that discard any number of cards for plus 1 coin each, which makes this very good and basically makes this a very powerful card. So those costs really outweigh it in a little way. This is definitely good in a money strategy deck when you're basically relying on your treasure cards in order to do the work for you. Not only that, if you are discarding action cards that you no longer need at the end of your turns, therefore giving you a much better chance on playing some very excellent cards for purchasing. So this will basically, if you got this very early on, you could basically set yourself up to discard estates and play those with your coppers in order to get plus 1 coin each. Now, this is good for a few different reasons. First off, let's take a look at this. You could actually pick up a grand market early enough if you discarded all of your coppers and your estates in your hand. Therefore, you would not have any of those to prevent you from picking up grand markets. Non-terminal draw, if you're basically drawing into cards that generate a lot of coin, that's also very good as well. Again, big money, you are basically using every card available to you to generate as much coin as possible, which means you do need a few actions to do it, and Monument is a good follow-up on this. However, another good one is Scrying Pool. Basically, draw out of your cards into your into any non-action cards and basically using those toward Vault. Definitely good too. Surprisingly enough, Library also works well as well. If you're discarding any action cards with Vault in your hand and then getting ready to discard those, you can set yourself up for potentially getting some good draws early on. This is also good prior to playing Tactician, where you could just basically discard everything minus a Tactician to generate enough coin to purchase something before playing Tactician, and then getting your purchase before your Tactician turn. That is good. The one downside I see on this card is this really does not work great in strong trashing. So Chapel and Steward could actually detriment this deck much more powerfully, especially if you're going to lose estates. They can be useful later on. Some engines are constructed with the aid of those trashers, but other than that, not really a benefit there. You basically want to make sure that you know that some of the cards that you're going to discard you can still use before you decide to trash them. Because if you start destroying the cards that you know that you were going to use for Vault's effect, in the long run, Vault is going to lose potential, and at that point, you might as well just trash Vault too. This is basically an early game card. This actually should be one of the first purchases you make on a 5-2 split, because again, you do this correct, you basically can get a gold a lot faster than your opponent, setting yourself up for a lot more cash on hand. So this should be one of the last few cards you play in your hand before your buy phase, making sure that you have enough coin to do it. And if you have plenty of treasures, you should also have plenty of buys as well. Again, early game, getting ready for some very powerful treasure cards, or mid game if you need a little extra bump in the road there. Definitely not a late game card though. A little fun one. And we have one last treasure card that was added to the set. Still more to talk about.
Venture.
Costing 5 to purchase, generating 1 coin. Reveal cards from your deck until you reveal a treasure. Discard the other cards, play that treasure. This is definitely good for a big money game deck. Basically relying on the fact that you've already trashed your coppers in order to take advantage of this, because otherwise, it's a very weak card. You need to actually make sure that it's worth playing these treasures. So you might only need a couple of silvers and an astrolabe or two, but most of your deck, if you're going big money, should rely heavily on golds and platinums to really use Venture's full potential. But that is basically it for this card. Your primary use case, top money deck, very limited draw, or even no draw, but you're able to trash the copper. So Moneylender is a good option to work around this, giving you a much better fill on getting some very expensive treasure cards. You could probably build a deck of golds and platinums only, thankfully using Venture. But at that point, you probably don't need Venture to help you through the end of this. If you can't trash coppers, it's not worth taking it at 5. You need to be able to draw into your treasure. But if you draw into it too much, Venture is not going to do a lot for you. If you're basically relying on cards for your, if you're relying on action cards that generate your coin, you're not going to see this often. Junk heavy decks, I'd say. The best counter to Mountebank would be Venture, because you basically can get through all of your curses this way, but you still would have the issue of drawing into the coppers. So you would need to play Moneylender on top of that. Venture into Bank, and that would be great. You could also venture into Quarry as well, making that a little bit easier to work with. It only has one viable synergy and one potential deck, and other than that, if you can't get it running, it's pretty much a dead card nonstop. So if you're going to pick this up, it is definitely not an early game card. I don't see this potentially work. Excuse me, can I help you? Can you not?
Who the hell do you think you are?
A few moments later.
That's taken care of. Mid-game card! I would not see this as an early game card unless you picked up treasures quite enough. Oh, he left already! About freaking time! Limited in uses. Next up, we have a newer reaction card that was introduced in Prosperity, Watchtower. Costing 3 to purchase. The action effect, draw until you have 6 cards in hand. The reaction, when you gain a card, you may reveal this from your hand to either trash that card or put it onto your deck. Now, this ranges from, okay, I guess it's not bad, to, yes. So let's look at it this way. This is essentially a smaller variant of Library, drawing until you have 6 cards in your hand. This is fantastic against hand size attacks like Militia, or because you played something like Vault, for example, where you can just play back into your hand, potentially getting more treasures for you to add to that buy for this turn. That's pretty good. But this is also strongest when you're starting to thin out your copies and states, and you can get coin from your action cards as well. It's fine to use Watchtower early on because of that in the opening +2 cards, which is moderately useful in cycling, but you want to be careful if it collides too much with other terminal cards. Its reaction effect is where it's going to shine a lot better for specifically 2 reasons. First off, anything you purchase, you can use the reaction effect to basically put it on top of your deck. So Grand Market, King's Court, Peddler, any of those lovely cards, just put them right on top of there. Not a big issue there. However, this is a very good counter against curse generation, because basically, let's say, for example, you were forced to deal with Mountebank's effect of gaining both a curse and a copper. You can reveal the Watchtower for both of those and basically instantly trash them, making the effect rather mute. This is also a very cheap reaction against Familiar as well, including Seawitch, Sea Hag, and a way to offset against Embargo also, which also makes going against Blockade a nice counter as well. I see people probably going to be using this more for its reaction, preferably instead of its action effect, but that draw is nothing to scoff at, especially if your hand size is very limited. This is a much better viable option over Moat when your hand size is small enough to take advantage of it. If you can't get +2 at the very least, then Moat's going to be your much better effect. For its cost, early game is good, mid game is good too. If they're picking up Mountebank, you're basically ready to go with this card. Any counter, basically anything curse generation, this should be one of your top purchases right off the bat, and as long as you can draw into this quick enough, it's good. For its action effect, definitely something you should be playing like near the end of your turns. That way you have basically a lot of cards available to you, especially if you have more actions to spend because of Watchtower's effect. And the final card for Prosperity 1.0, Workers' Village. Cost 4 to purchase, +1 card. plus 2 actions, plus 1 buy. Simple as that. Basically, a slight upgrade over a village with an extra buy at a low price. This is a very good addition to most engines. Basically, topping off quite well in your draw power engines. With the amount of actions you will have available to you, this opens up basically some good work. Now, the plus buys might not help you early on. I mean, I could say the same about Astrolabe as well, but you can't scoff at having an extra buy when you need it the most, especially if you can continuously play a few of these workers' villages. Well, hey, guess what's available for you to pick up? Peddler. And that's a good way to look at it this way, because you can consistently keep getting the peddlers and working workers' village around that, so you always have more actions and you have more draws, and you basically can still draw into it. You want to make sure that you have bridges and even a quarry or two available to you to take advantage of it. Again, the buys are not going to be really relevant until later on, but if you're buying this over a regular village, you want it for basically the plus card plus action effect, and that's simple enough to take advantage of. This is definitely an earlier mid-game card. This works well in the late game as well if you can generate enough coin to purchase multiple victory cards. Again, you want to couple this with cost reduction. Is probably its primary use, and a peddler is available to you. Once you start buying Workers Village, peddlers should be your next viable target at that point, which can work you into Grand Market if it's available to you. This is a good follow-up on as well King's Court, plus 3 cards, plus 6 actions, plus 3 buys. You're basically gonna have a very good fun turn with this card. It is very good in pretty much any deck you could play, same as Peddler. And that was the last card for Prosperity version 1.0. In the next video, we will discuss the update pack, which contains the version 2.0 cards and the ones that were removed from version 1.0. 9 going out, 9 coming in. Simple as that. Thank you very much for watching the video, guys. If you like what you see, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Every like, every comment, every subscribe helps. It will help improve the channel. It'll help me get better content. Whatever you can do to help out the channel, it would be greatly appreciated. You can also check out my Twitter for updates, as well as my Twitch for my streams on Dominion and Final Fantasy XIV as well. I hope to do more streams, especially with some map runs, and you might see me join some other streamers as well. If you had seen my previous tweet, I was helping a fellow streamer with some map runs. Fun run altogether, 5 hours in all, and we made some good money in the game. Always the theme. And with that, thank you again, guys, and I will see you next time. Peace.